Good evening, I'm Amirul Aiman. Here are the top stories for tonight. Trump's 50% tariffs on Indian goods take effect amid Russia ties, and Malaysia to host RCEP summit in October. That and more coming up on AWANI International. US President Donald Trump's steep tariffs on Indian goods have come into effect on Wednesday, weeks after he imposed an extra 25% penalty on India's imports tied to its purchases of Russian oils and weapons. The new duties push some tariffs as high as 50%, putting India among the countries facing the highest US tariffs in the world.
New Delhi warned said it began reviewing possible retaliatory steps, while urging greater domestic self-reliance to weather the impact. The punitive tariffs will affect more than half of India's exports to the US, covering garments, jewelry, chemicals, and other goods. Export groups warned that the hikes could leave Indian products at a 30 to 35% price disadvantage against competitors like Vietnam and Bangladesh. The Indian government is moving quickly to limit the impact. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has pledged tax cuts, bank subsidies, and support for exporters to diversify markets. Despite the tariffs, both governments reaffirmed their strategic partnership, issuing joint statements this week to highlight defense cooperation and their commitment to the Quad Alliance with Japan and Australia.
Malaysia is taking the lead as ASEAN chair in hosting a regional comprehensive economic partnership or RCEP summit this October during the 47th ASEAN Summit. Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim says the summit will highlight Asia's role in driving openness at a time of rising protectionism.
The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership remains the largest free trade area in the world, covering 30% of the global GDP. But RCEP must not remain a legal text on paper. It must be renewed with political energy. Now, Malaysia intends to convene an RCEP summit in October in conjunction with the ASEAN Leaders Summit. The aim is to take stock, accelerate implementation, and to demonstrate that Asia can still lead the cause of openness even as others turn inward.
He was speaking at the Kuala Lumpur Roundtable on Asia-Pacific Regional Cooperation at Shangri-La, KL. Meanwhile, sharing his insights on the discussions there, ISIS Malaysia chairperson Datuk Prof. Dr. Muhammad Faiz Abdullah said countries showed they are taking a coordinated approach, tackling US tariffs with collective strength.
There is a general consensus that there has got to be the need not to be hysterical about the reaction, but to be a bit more sensible here. But that doesn't mean capitulation. That doesn't mean, the white flag doctrine of surrender. What it means is that nations with common interests must get together and build up the strength to get that critical mass in order to put their positions better when dealing with the question of tariffs. We have representatives in those areas where you could solicit their views specifically on how the tariff situation is working out. But there is no panic, there is no gloom and doom, in the sense that challenges are there, headwinds are there, but there will be a resolve to deal with it accordingly.
Our correspondent Farhana Sheikh was at the Kuala Lumpur Roundtable on Asia-Pacific Regional Cooperation, bringing you the key takeaways and what they mean for the region.
The Kuala Lumpur Roundtable on Asia-Pacific Cooperation has wrapped up after 2 days of intense discussion. Now, policymakers and thought leaders have reaffirmed their commitment to multilateralism, calling for greater openness in the face of shifting global dynamics as well as rising protectionism. Now, they also looked into ways to tap into opportunities for digital economy as well as green development. Now, the event was graced by the presence of Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, who's in his special address talked about the strength of ASEAN's centrality in fostering fostering greater collaboration and deeper unity. Now, building on that, after the session, I managed to catch up with former U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Mr. Carlos Gutierrez, to talk about the way forward for the region in today's shifting global order. Let's hear what he has to say.
Because the trend today is toward more of bilateralism. And bilateralism on a global scale would create some confusion and a lot of different standards. So countries are going to have to push and be committed to a multilateralism. You know, in the absence of a multilateral order, say the WTO, which is becoming less and less effective, then regions within regions, like ASEAN, I think will be very valuable because that prevents falling into a world of bilateralism or unilateralism. So I think ASEAN has big opportunities. I think there's a good moment for ASEAN if they could work on even more integration.
Commenting on U.S. tariffs, Carlos urged smaller economies to stay open and resist protectionist measures.
The tariff effort, the tariff strategy, if we can call it that, is very bilateral because, with the exception of the European Union, it was very much about countries, the U.S. negotiating with individual countries. I think that eventually will settle into a uniform tariff in the U.S., perhaps 15%. And then we can get back to less of bilateral and more of regional or multilateral. There's no question that today the challenge is how to get beyond the bilateral relationships, because yes, a lot of the agreements have been bilateral with the U.S. So we have to look beyond that and know that there's a time when we'll have to think about regional and multilateral world order, to be aggressive about bilateral agreements, to be aggressive about trade, to open the economy. To fall into protectionism at this moment could be very detrimental to smaller markets, smaller countries. So I would say look for opportunities to have agreements with other countries and not fall into protectionism.
Stay tuned for more after the break.
Buli di sekolah. Isu ini bukan perkara baru.
Buli tertakluk kepada perbuatan agresif secara fizikal.
Apa sebenarnya Jurabu punca utama yang menyumbang kepada masalah ini serta kesannya kepada kesihatan kita?
Mereka akan mengalami iritasi kepada mata. Selain itu, iritasi kepada saluran pernafasan.
US President Donald Trump says American colleges would struggle without Chinese students, as he backs allowing 600,000 to study in the country amid trade talks with Beijing. He adds that the students are vital for both education and trade, and their presence helps strengthen cooperation with China, though the plan has drawn some backlash from his base. At a White House cabinet meeting, he described a ban on Chinese students as insulting and harmful to academic institutions. He noted that top universities might endure, but smaller colleges could collapse without international enrollment. However, Trump stressed that strict vetting would remain in place despite the proposal. In response, China expressed hope that the US would fulfill Trump's pledge to welcome Chinese students. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun said the US must cease unprovoked harassment, interrogation, and deportation of Chinese students. United States President Donald Trump says he is prepared to impose sanctions on Russia if Kremlin refuses a ceasefire in Ukraine. He explains that his plan involves tough sanctions as he does not want the conflict to escalate into global war.
At a White House cabinet meeting, Trump said the confrontation would not become a world war but an economic one. He also suggested tariffs could be used against both Russia and Ukraine to push them towards peace. Meanwhile, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff confirmed he will meet Ukrainian representatives in New York this week. He also said Washington continues direct talks with Moscow as part of its effort to end the conflict. Witkoff added that a bilateral meeting between Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky remains possible, but believes Trump's presence will be essential for any final agreement.
Russia has rejected European proposals for security guarantees in Ukraine, saying it will not accept any NATO troops on Ukrainian soil. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says European troop deployment would effectively mean a NATO presence, something Moscow has sought to prevent from the start. At the same time, Peskov praised US President Donald Trump's efforts to end the war and said Russia hopes they will continue. European allies are working on guarantees to protect Ukraine from future attacks, but all sides disagree on the details. Russia says it should be one of the guarantors of Ukraine's security and wants to revive a proposal that was discussed between the two sides in 2022 in the early weeks of the war. Kyiv rejects that, saying it would give Moscow too much control over foreign military support. The Trump administration is considering taking stakes in America's biggest defense contractors, Boeing and Palantir. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick says Pentagon leaders are talking about new ways to fund weapons production, pointing out that Lockheed already gets almost all of its revenue from the US government. Speaking on CNBC, Lutnick said Lockheed derives 97% of its revenue from the US government, calling the company basically an arm of the government. Shares of Lockheed rose about 1.6% after his remarks. Boeing gained close to 3%. Palantir gained 1.4% after revising early losses. This is not an isolated move. Washington recently bought nearly 10% of Intel, secured a golden share in US Steel, and struck deals with Nvidia, AMD, and rare earths company MP Materials. The White House says these steps strengthen national security and ensure control over critical industries, but the approach marks a sharp break from the past practice. Direct government ownership has usually been reserved for wartime or to rescue struggling firms. Critics warn it risks blurring the line between state and business and could ultimately limit how companies compete and innovate. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says customs duties from President Trump's tariffs could top $500 billion a year, far higher than earlier estimates. He explained collections typically jump from July through September and could even push revenues towards $1 trillion, helping to narrow America's budget deficit. Bessent said his earlier forecast of $300 billion was too low. He now argues the tariff windfall will offset the shortfall created by the Republicans' tax cuts and spending bill passed this year. The Congressional Budget Office had projected that legislation would widen the deficit by more than $3 trillion over the next decade. But Bessent said updated estimates show tariffs could actually cut deficits by $4 trillion and possibly more if collections keep rising. Hamas is rejecting Israeli military claims that its fighters had placed a camera near Gaza's Nasser hospital, where at least 20 people were killed in an Israeli strike on Monday, including 5 journalists. Hamas says only 2 of its fighters were killed that day, but in separate locations, far from the hospital. Israel's military says its troops thought they had identified a camera positioned by Hamas to monitor their movements. The army admits that was only an initial assessment and says a fuller investigation will examine how the strike was authorized and who made the call in the field. The incident has drawn widespread condemnation and adds new scrutiny over Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza. That report wraps up AWANI International tonight. Stay tuned for our reports on the rivalries, strategies, and the shifts behind the power affairs driving the new global order. Visit international.astroawani.com for more. Be sure to follow our social media accounts. I'm Amirul Aiman. Thank you for watching. Good night.